Several younger fishermen laughed as they walked past. "That boat belongs in a museum," one joked. Ryan Cooper, a 33-year-old captain operating one of the harbor's most advanced fishing vessels, grinned and called out, "Good luck finding fish without a sonar, Captain." Sam simply smiled. The ocean was showing fishermen where the fish were long before sonar existed. The fleet headed toward the coordinates suggested by their electronics, while Sam quietly steered in a completely different direction. A few hours later, an unexpected Pacific storm swept across the coast. Waves grew violent, sonar systems struggled, and one boat after another returned to the harbor with almost empty holds. Then an old wooden boat slowly emerged through the rain. It was Grace. As it reached the dock, everyone fell silent. Sam's fish hold was completely full of Pacific salmon. Before anyone could ask how he had done it, Harbor Master Captain Elizabeth Morgan stepped forward, shook the old fisherman's hand with both of hers, and said, "Welcome home, Captain Bennett, the man who taught this harbor that the ocean always leaves clues for those patient enough to see them." Before sunrise, Newport Harbor in Oregon was alive with powerful commercial fishing boats preparing for the opening of salmon season. Modern vessels loaded the latest sonar systems, satellite navigation, and computerized fish finders. At the very end of the dock stood 80-year-old Captain Samuel "Sam" Bennett, quietly preparing his 48-year-old wooden fishing boat named Grace. Its faded paint, old brass compass, and weathered wheel made it look hopelessly outdated beside the sleek modern fleet. The first morning of salmon season began long before sunrise at Newport Harbor. Powerful fishing boats lined the docks, their diesel engines rumbling while crews loaded ice, fuel, bait, and the latest electronic equipment. Large sonar displays glowed inside spotless wheelhouses, satellite weather systems updated every few seconds, and computerized fish finders promised to locate schools of salmon miles beneath the surface. Most captains believed that success depended on having the newest technology money could buy. Quietly tied to the last berth on Pier 7 was a very different boat. Its name, Grace, was painted by hand across the weathered cedar stern. The 48-year-old wooden fishing boat showed every year it had spent battling Pacific storms. The paint had faded beneath countless winters. The brass compass inside the wheelhouse had lost much of its shine. The wooden steering wheel had become smooth from decades of use. Standing beside it was 80-year-old Captain Samuel "Sam" Bennett. He wore a faded yellow rain jacket, heavy rubber boots, thick wool trousers, and an old navy blue captain's cap embroidered with the boat's name. Before starting the engine, Sam quietly ran his hand along the wooden railing as though greeting an old friend. Several younger fishermen watched with amused smiles. One nudged his partner. "He's talking to the boat again." Another laughed. "Maybe it'll tell him where the fish are." The loudest voice belonged to Ryan Cooper, a successful 33-year-old captain whose company had recently purchased one of the harbor's newest commercial vessels. His boat carried high-definition sonar, satellite navigation, artificial intelligence, fish prediction software, and equipment worth more than most houses in town. Ryan looked toward Grace and shook his head. "Morning, Captain." He smiled confidently. "Need me to send you today's fish coordinates?" A few crew members laughed. Sam smiled back. "Thank you," he replied politely. "I already have my own." Ryan glanced around the empty wheelhouse. "Really?" he asked. "Where's your screen?" Sam tapped the side of his head with one finger. "Still working after all these years." More laughter echoed across the dock. No one noticed Harbor Master Elizabeth Morgan watching quietly from the harbor office balcony. She simply smiled without saying a word. As the fleet prepared to leave, the captains compared weather forecasts. Every report predicted calm seas until late afternoon with excellent fishing conditions 40 miles offshore. Ryan proudly announced his destination over the radio, and several boats decided to follow his route. Sam untied Grace without joining the conversation. Instead of looking at electronic maps, he stood silently on deck, watching the flight of gulls circling above the harbor entrance. He studied the direction of the morning swell, the movement of floating kelp, the smell carried by the cool offshore breeze, and the unusual silence of several seabirds resting on the breakwater. One young deckhand noticed him. "What are you looking at?" Sam smiled gently. "The forecast." The young man laughed. "There's no weather app out there." Sam looked toward the horizon where a thin gray cloud stretched almost invisibly across the western sky. "No," he answered quietly. "It's much older than that." Minutes later, the harbor bell rang. signaling the official start of the season. One by one, sleek modern boats accelerated toward the open Pacific, engines roaring as they raced toward the satellite coordinates. Grace left the harbor last. Instead of following the fleet west, Sam slowly turned the wheel south along the coastline. Ryan noticed immediately. "There goes the old man," he joked over the radio. "Either he's chasing yesterday's fish, or he forgot which ocean we're fishing." Laughter filled the radio channel. Sam never answered. He simply guided Grace through the gentle swells with calm confidence, his eyes fixed not on instruments, but on the sea itself. None of the fishermen realized that the ocean had already begun changing in ways no satellite forecast had yet detected. And the old captain had noticed the first warning signs before anyone else had even left the harbor. Nearly 2 hours after leaving Newport Harbor, the fleet had spread across the Pacific, exactly where the satellite forecasts predicted the largest schools of salmon would be waiting. Ryan Cooper's state-of-the-art vessel led the group. Inside the wheelhouse, multiple sonar screens displayed underwater contours, water temperature, baitfish movement, and fish density in remarkable detail. "There they are." Ryan smiled confidently as bright clusters appeared on the monitor. "Drop the nets." Around him, several other captains followed the same electronic data. Nets disappeared beneath the waves, while hydraulic winches hummed across the fleet. Yet, after nearly 40 minutes of fishing, something felt wrong. The catches were far smaller than expected. "That's strange," one captain muttered over the radio. "The sonar says they're here." Another replied, "Mine too. But the nets are almost empty." Ryan frowned as another haul came aboard with only a handful of salmon. "Run another scan." The electronics confirmed the same result. The fish should have been there. But they weren't. Nearly 15 miles away, Captain Sam Bennett continued cruising south aboard Grace. He hadn't lowered his nets once. Instead, he stood quietly in the wheelhouse, with one hand resting on the old wooden helm, while watching the ocean around him. A deckhand named Caleb finally asked the question that had been bothering him all morning. "Captain, if we're not following the sonar, what are we following?" Sam smiled without taking his eyes off the water. "The fish." Caleb looked puzzled. "I don't see any fish." Sam pointed toward the sky. "Exactly." Caleb looked upward. A flock of gulls circled lazily hundreds of feet above the water before suddenly changing direction all at once. Farther away, several pelicans abandoned an area that should have been full of baitfish. Sam nodded quietly. "They're leaving." Caleb frowned. "Because of the storm?" Sam smiled. "Because they already know it's coming." He then pointed toward the surface of the sea. "Look at the color." Caleb leaned over the rail. The water had gradually shifted from a deep blue to a darker green, streaked with long silver currents. Sam dipped his fingers into the ocean before rubbing the water between his thumb and forefinger. The cold current arrived early. Caleb looked confused. "You can tell that just by touching it?" Sam chuckled softly. "Not by touching it once." He smiled. "By touching it for 50 years, Grace continued moving south while the old captain quietly watched floating patches of kelp drifting in a direction opposite to the surface swell. "The current below us has already changed," he explained. "The salmon will follow it before any satellite notices." Just then, Sam reached beneath the wheelhouse bench and pulled out a faded leather logbook. Its pages were filled with handwritten entries dating back almost half a century. He carefully opened to a section labeled September Storms. One note immediately caught Caleb's attention. "When gulls climb higher than usual, kelp drifts south against the swell, and the water cools before noon. The salmon move toward the southern shelf 6 to 8 hours before the storm arrives." Caleb looked up in amazement. "You wrote that?" Sam smiled. "No." He pointed toward a second style of handwriting beside the note. "My father did." Before Caleb could ask another question, the radio suddenly burst to life. "Attention all vessels," the Coast Guard announced. "A fast-moving storm system has intensified unexpectedly, wind speeds increasing. All boats are advised to prepare for severe conditions almost immediately." Worried voices filled the radio. "The forecast never showed this. We're already seeing 12-foot swells. We're pulling the nets." Ryan looked through the wheelhouse windows as the calm Pacific transformed before his eyes. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, and the wind strengthened far faster than anyone expected. He glanced once more at the sonar. The fish had disappeared from the screen entirely. Meanwhile, Sam calmly closed the old logbook and adjusted Grace's course by only a few degrees. Caleb looked at him nervously. "Captain, shouldn't we head back?" Sam smiled gently. Not yet. He pointed toward the distant horizon where hundreds of seabirds had suddenly begun diving into the water. Now, he said quietly, the ocean is finally showing us where breakfast is. The Pacific changed within minutes. Calm swells became towering walls of water as wind-driven rain swept across the fleet. One after another, captains abandoned their fishing grounds and began hauling in their nets before the storm became too dangerous. Radio traffic filled with anxious voices. Nets are coming up empty. We're taking water over the bow. Turn back while we still can. Ryan Cooper gripped the wheel of his modern vessel as the radar screen flickered through sheets of rain. His sonar still searched desperately beneath the waves, but the images had become distorted by the violent sea. Nothing, one crewman shouted. The fish are gone. Ryan looked toward the horizon in frustration. They couldn't have disappeared. 15 miles to the south, Captain Sam Bennett finally slowed Grace. He studied the surface of the water without looking at a single instrument. Hundreds of gulls circled low above one narrow stretch of ocean, while small baitfish occasionally broke through the surface, chased from below by something much larger. Sam smiled quietly. There you are. Caleb looked across the waves, but saw nothing except rain and whitecaps. Captain, how can you be sure? Sam pointed toward the birds. Notice how they aren't diving everywhere. Caleb watched carefully. The gulls remained concentrated inside one long strip of water, no wider than a football field. Sam continued. Now look at the current. Floating strands of kelp drifted steadily beneath the birds, despite the waves moving in another direction. Then he pointed toward the color of the sea. A faint emerald band stretched across the darker water. Cold water rising from below, he explained. The salmon followed it before the storm arrived. Caleb nodded slowly. So the birds found the fish first. Sam smiled. The birds always do. He gave a quiet instruction. Set the nets. The crew obeyed. Unlike the other boats that had spent hours chasing electronic coordinates, Grace lowered her nets only once. The old wooden boat rolled gently with the swell, while Sam adjusted the engine just enough to keep the current working for him instead of against him. Several minutes passed in complete silence. Then the winch suddenly groaned under unexpected weight. Caleb looked toward the cable in surprise. Captain, the steel line tightened so hard it hummed against the rollers. We've got something big. Easy, Sam replied calmly. Let the ocean help lift it. The crew worked together as the heavy net slowly emerged from the dark water. Then the first silver flashes appeared. Salmon, hundreds of them. As more of the net surfaced, the deck erupted with astonished laughter. The hold began filling with large Pacific salmon, each shining like polished steel beneath the rain. Caleb stood speechless. I've never seen anything like this. Sam quietly smiled. Neither had the storm. At that exact moment, the radio crackled again. Ryan Cooper's voice came through, strained by the worsening weather. Any vessel south of Point Adams, report your position. Sam calmly reached for the microphone. Grace here. Ryan immediately recognized the call sign. Captain Bennett? Yes. Did you find anything? Sam looked toward the overflowing deck before answering. Enough. Several seconds of silence followed. Ryan finally spoke again. How? Sam glanced upward as the gulls continued circling above the water. I listened before I looked. The transmission ended. By late afternoon, the storm intensified even further. Every modern fishing boat turned back toward Newport Harbor with nearly empty holds. Choosing safety over one final attempt, Grace also headed home. Her old diesel engine rumbled steadily through the rough seas, while the heavy fish hold sat completely full beneath the deck. As the harbor finally appeared through the rain, fishermen waiting on the docks watched the returning fleet with disappointment. One after another, sleek modern vessels tied up carrying only a fraction of the day's expected catch. Then someone pointed toward the harbor entrance. Look. Emerging through the gray rain came the old cedar boat everyone had laughed at that morning. Grace rode the swells with quiet confidence, her stern sitting noticeably lower in the water from the tremendous weight below deck. As she reached the dock and the hatch was opened, complete silence spread across the harbor. The fish hold was filled from end to end with gleaming Pacific salmon. Before anyone could say a word, Harbor Master Elizabeth Morgan slowly removed her captain's cap. Looking at the elderly fisherman with unmistakable respect, she smiled and said, Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at the last captain in this harbor, who still knows how to read the ocean without asking it to explain itself. The docks of Newport Harbor remained silent as workers unloaded the overflowing catch from Grace. One by one, Fisherman walked closer, not to admire the old wooden boat anymore, but to understand how it had accomplished what none of the modern vessels could. Ryan Cooper stood quietly beside the dock, staring at the mountain of silver salmon filling the sorting tables. Only that morning he had laughed at Captain Sam Bennett's outdated boat. Now he could think of only one question. How did you know where they would be? Sam smiled gently as he wiped seawater from the worn wooden wheel. I didn't. Ryan looked confused. Sam nodded toward the ocean. I knew where the ocean was taking them. Harbor Master Elizabeth Morgan stepped forward carrying a weathered leather logbook she had retrieved from Grace's wheelhouse. She placed it carefully on a nearby wooden crate. Most of you have never seen this, she said. Captain Bennett has been writing in this journal after every fishing trip for nearly 50 years. Curious fishermen gathered around as Elizabeth slowly opened the faded pages. There were no complicated charts or computer printouts. Instead, every page contained handwritten observations. Wind shifted southwest before sunrise. Gulls flew higher than normal. Kelp drifted against the surface swell. Water cooled earlier than expected. Salmon arrived 6 hours before the storm. Another page read, never trust only one sign. Wait until the birds, the current, the tide, and the wind all tell the same story. Ryan quietly turned another page. The entries stretched back year after year, recording storms, tides, moon phases, migrations, water temperatures, and countless details that no fishing app could ever fully explain. Then he noticed something unusual. About halfway through the journal, the handwriting suddenly changed. This isn't yours, he said softly. Sam smiled. No. He gently touched the page. That's my father's writing. Elizabeth nodded. Samuel Bennett learned these waters from his father. His father learned from his grandfather, Sam quietly added. And every generation left the next one a few more pages. The fishermen looked at one another in silence. They were no longer looking at an old notebook. They were looking at nearly a century of knowledge carefully passed from one generation to another. Elizabeth carefully turned to the final section of the journal. Tucked inside the back cover rested a yellowed envelope sealed with faded blue wax. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were only a few words, for Samuel. Open this when someone finally understands that the ocean is the greatest teacher. Sam looked at the envelope for several long moments before slowly breaking the seal. The paper inside had become fragile with age. He unfolded it and began reading aloud. Dear Sam, if you are reading this, then someone has finally stopped asking where the fish are and started asking what the sea is trying to say. The fisherman stood perfectly still. Sam continued. Boats will become faster. Engines will become stronger. Machines will become clever enough to see beneath the waves. Welcome, every one of them. But remember this. No machine has ever smelled the rain before it arrives, watched birds abandon a feeding ground, or felt the current change beneath its feet. Ryan quietly lowered his eyes. Sam read the final page. The ocean never promises an easy living. It only rewards those humble enough to keep learning from it every day. He gently folded the letter and returned it to the logbook. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Ryan stepped forward, carrying the expensive digital tablet he had used throughout the competition. He looked at it, then at Sam. Captain, he said quietly, would you trade your logbook for every piece of technology on my boat? Sam smiled warmly. No. Ryan nodded. I didn't think so. Sam placed a reassuring hand on the young captain's shoulder. Keep your technology. He glanced toward the harbor, where dozens of fishing boats rested side by side. Just don't let it become the only thing you know how to read. Elizabeth then uncovered a polished wooden display that had quietly been prepared inside the harbor office. Resting beneath protective glass were Sam's father's compass, the family's first fishing license, the weathered leather logbook, and an engraved bronze plaque reading, "The Bennett Maritime Legacy," dedicated to the captains who taught generations that the sea always leaves clues for those patient enough to notice them. The applause that followed echoed across Newport Harbor, not for the largest catch of the season, but for a lifetime spent proving that wisdom gathered one voyage at a time can become the most valuable chart any captain will ever own. The story of Captain Samuel Sam Bennett spread quickly along the Pacific coast. What began as a tale about an old wooden fishing boat returning safely through a storm soon became a lesson discussed in fishing harbors from Oregon to Alaska. Newspapers first reported that the oldest boat in Newport Harbor had landed the largest catch of the season, while every modern vessel returned nearly empty. But the fisherman who had witnessed that day knew the real story had very little to do with fish. It was about a man who had spent 50 years learning to read an ocean that never stopped teaching. A few months later, the Oregon Fishermen's Association invited Sam to speak during its annual Safety and Navigation Conference. Hundreds of commercial captains, Coast Guard officers, marine biologists, and young deckhands filled the auditorium. Many expected him to criticize modern technology after what had happened during the storm. Instead, Sam walked onto the stage, carrying only his weathered leather logbook and his father's old brass compass. He placed both on the table before looking across the audience with a warm smile. "People have been asking me the wrong question," he began. "They ask whether I trust experience more than technology." He gently shook his head. "I trust both." The room became completely silent. Sam picked up the brass compass. "This has guided me for 50 years. He then held up a modern GPS receiver that Ryan Cooper had given him after the storm. "And this can save lives." He smiled. "A wise captain never refuses a good tool." Several people nodded. Sam looked toward the audience. "The mistake begins when the tool becomes the only thing you're listening to." He opened the old logbook to its first page. Instead of numbers or fishing locations, the audience saw only a handwritten question. "What is the ocean trying to tell you today?" Sam closed the book again. "Every fishing trip I ever made began with that question." Ryan Cooper, now sitting in the front row, smiled quietly. Since the storm, he had started keeping his own handwritten journal after every voyage, recording birds, currents, weather, tides, and everything Sam had taught him to notice. At the end of the conference, Harbor Master Elizabeth Morgan stepped onto the stage carrying a framed document. "Captain Bennett," she announced proudly, "the Newport Harbor Authority has voted unanimously to preserve Grace as a permanent maritime heritage vessel." The audience erupted into applause. She continued, "Beginning next spring, every new commercial fishing captain licensed through this harbor will spend one day aboard Grace before receiving certification." Another surprise followed. The old harbor warehouse overlooking Pier 7 had been transformed into the Samuel Bennett Maritime Learning Center. Inside were preserved Grace's original brass compass, the family's leather logbook spanning 3 generations, Sam's weathered captain's hat, his yellow rain jacket, and the handwritten letter from his father. Visitors expected to find advanced navigation charts. Instead, the first page, displayed beneath glass, contained only one sentence: "Before you ask where the fish are, ask what the sea has already shown you." Years later, after Captain Samuel Bennett peacefully passed away at the age of 93, thousands of young fishermen visited the Learning Center before taking command of their first boats. Before studying sonar, radar, GPS navigation, or satellite weather systems, they were required to spend an hour standing on the harbor breakwater at sunrise, with nothing but a notebook. Their first assignment was simple: write down everything you notice. Some wrote about gulls circling above the waves. Others described changing tides, shifting winds, distant clouds, floating kelp, or the smell of salt carried by the morning breeze. Only after learning to observe were they introduced to the harbor's modern navigation technology. Above the entrance to the Samuel Bennett Maritime Learning Center stood a bronze plaque carrying the words that became the guiding philosophy of generations of Pacific fishermen. "Technology can tell you where to sail. Wisdom teaches you when, why, and whether you should." Most visitors left believing they had learned how one old fisherman caught more fish than anyone else during a storm. Those who truly understood Samuel Bennett's legacy realized they had learned something far more valuable. The greatest captains are not remembered because they owned the newest boats or the most powerful equipment. They are remembered because they never stopped being students of the sea, understanding that every wave, every tide, every bird, every current, and every sunrise still has something to teach those humble enough to watch, listen, and learn. The story of Captain Samuel "Sam" Bennett soon spread far beyond Newport Harbor. At first, newspapers described it as the incredible day an old wooden fishing boat returned safely through a violent Pacific storm with a hold full of salmon, while newer, faster, and far more expensive vessels came back nearly empty. But as journalists interviewed the captains who had witnessed that unforgettable morning, everyone reached the same conclusion: the story had never been about an old boat defeating modern technology. It had always been about a man who spent an entire lifetime learning a language the ocean had been quietly speaking long before engines, sonar, or satellites ever existed. In the months that followed, maritime academies, commercial fishing associations, Coast Guard training centers, and fishing communities across the Pacific coast began sharing Sam's story with every new generation of captains, not to discourage technology, not to glorify the past, but to remind every sailor that the finest equipment in the world can only guide someone who first learns how to observe. Whenever reporters asked Captain Bennett how he managed to find fish during a storm that fooled nearly every electronic system, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "I never chased the fish," he said. "I simply followed what the ocean had already decided." Several years later, Sam was invited to deliver the opening address at the National Maritime Leadership Conference. Hundreds of captains, marine scientists, rescue coordinators, naval officers, and young fishermen filled the auditorium expecting to hear secret fishing techniques from the legendary old captain. Instead, Sam walked onto the stage carrying nothing except his father's weathered leather logbook. He slowly opened it to the very first page. There were no maps, no secret fishing grounds, no handwritten coordinates, only a single question written decades earlier in faded blue ink. "What is the sea trying to tell you today?" Sam looked across the silent audience before gently closing the book. "My father asked me that question every morning before we untied a single rope," he said. "I've been trying to answer it for more than 50 years. He paused for a moment before continuing. "The ocean changes every day. The captain who believes he already knows everything is the first one. The sea will humble." The audience rose together in a standing ovation before he had even finished speaking. Years after Captain Samuel Bennett peacefully passed away at the age of 93, his beloved cedar fishing boat Grace remained preserved inside the Samuel Bennett Maritime Learning Center overlooking Newport Harbor. Visitors admired the polished brass compass, the worn wooden wheel, the faded yellow rain jacket, the leather logbook filled with thousands of handwritten observations collected across 3 generations, and the simple captain's hat that had weathered countless Pacific storms. Yet the object that touched people most was neither the boat nor the journal. Hanging quietly beside them was a small wooden plaque engraved with a sentence that became the philosophy of generations of fishermen. "The ocean never promises to become easier. It simply rewards those who never stop learning." Perhaps that is why Samuel Bennett never believed he was the greatest fisherman in Newport Harbor. He believed he had simply remained a student for longer than most, a student of the tides, a student of the wind, a student of seabirds, a student of storms, a student of patience. Because the greatest captains are never remembered for sailing the newest boats or owning the finest equipment. They are remembered because they respected the sea enough to keep learning from it until their very last voyage. And perhaps that was Captain Samuel Bennett's greatest legacy, not the largest catch of the season, not the day an entire harbor stopped laughing at his old wooden boat, not even the countless young captains he inspired afterward. His greatest achievement was reminding the world that before we ask nature to provide for us, we must first become humble enough to listen to what it has been trying to teach us all along.